Glad we all made our way back from the floor. Thank you. So in further sort of technical issues related to taxes that aren't actually taxes, want to share some drafting that I did with Abby and a few other stakeholders. That is a follow-up from this fall. We had the income-based tax, what was that called, Scott?
Income-based education tax study committee?
Yeah, I think that's it. And as really sort of an aside to that work, we recommended the idea of breaking out non-homestead taxes into more categories. And so I think I've had conversations with most of the members of the committee and sort of the lead up to this. And Abby has put together some language to begin the conversation about what that might look like. It's up on our committee page and Abby's going to walk us through it. And again, no fiscal impact. It's just further sort of technical pieces of this in this world. I promise we'll get to the money soon, everyone. Maybe next week. Abby, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
Yes, we can.
Great. I have a new webcam that I'm using that I'm always worried it's not picking up the sound correctly, but that seems to be working great. So for the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. There are two documents under my name. There's the draft language, it's draft 1.4. And then there's also two different kind of flow charts that I put together to help sort of think about it more systemically, and because these are categories, how they would all fit into the existing system, as well as what the definitions actually are. So on the first, I think maybe it would make more sense to start with that, and then I can talk about the draft language. Does that work, Madam Chair?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So I think that just sort of sets the stage for sort of more of the detail that's in the actual language. So looking at the flow chart, I have, reads from left to right, and I tried to color code these to distinguish between different levels of categories. So the first level is property classification. So that's existing law. You have homestead, which is the primary dwelling and the surrounding land. Then there is non-homestead, which is everything else except for exempt property. So I put a third category there, or classification. It's not really a classification, but a third group there. So you have exempt, homestead, and non-homestead. And what this draft does is within that homestead, or within that non-homestead classification, it creates additional categories. And those are the purple little bullets that you have there. And to take a further step back, the genesis of this language over the last few years, there's been a lot of discussion about getting at different data that the grand list doesn't currently collect. And it's within this non-homestead classification, trying to parse out what are different types of properties that fall within the non-homestead classification. Is there any data on, for example, secondary homes or vacant homes? There's been a lot of discussion in the news about houses and rental units in Vermont that are not primary dwellings. How can you categorize and quantify those? On the current grand list, there are some categories that do reflect some of the names that are in this language, and you'll see in those purple bubbles. However, those are not enacted in statute. Those are not codified. And it also depends on each town's lister or assessor how exactly they categorize non-homestead properties within those types of groups. For example, there is residential up to a certain number of acres or units. But again, it's not under current statute, and the way current law is very broad when it talks about non-homestead, there is no uniform way of categorizing properties. So that is the background leading up to this bill. And it, as Madam Chair mentioned, it was discussed a fair amount during the Income-Based Education Tax Study Committee last fall. So this bill now creates categories within the classification of non-homestead. So looking at the purple bubbles here, I've listed them just alphabetically as they show up in the draft language, but they could also be grouped together by types of properties. So the first is affordable housing. If you jump down further, you'll see there's also rental housing. So those are two distinct categories. And then there are two other definitions for types of dwellings. One is seasonal and one is secondary non-seasonal dwellings. So that's all within the what is non-homestead, but is a type of housing. Those are the four there that deal with and would create separate categories for different types of housing. Within the more commercial or business use, there are several different definitions for those types of properties. So there's commercial property, which is used as sort of a catch-all for any property that's used for a business purpose that doesn't fit into any of these other categories. There's also industrial, so that's manufacturing and processing. And then all the way down at the bottom is utilities, and that's a very broad category to capture any utilities that the Public Utility Commission or the Department of Public, sorry, I'm gonna get this wrong. The Department of Public Service. So those are any utilities that are regulated by those two state entities. To dive in a little bit more into, oh, and sorry, I left out the other category that would also apply here is open land and structures. So I'll take that. You'll see that has the most sort of parsing that's going on there because it does overlap with some other areas of existing law. So if you look at the land, moving over into the blue bubble there, land is defined in three different ways. So it could be agricultural land, forest land, or unproductive land. So that's getting at, again, this is only within the non-homestead. So if you have a homestead that has open land or structures on it, it would not be reflected in this category the way this is drafted because it's only categorizing non-homestead property. Those three types will probably sound familiar, that those terminologies will probably remind you of current use because those are used in current use. They are not defined specifically here using current use definitions. The language does say these will all be considered open land or structure category uses if they fall into these buckets. It's irrespective of enrollment in current use. And because this language is only creating categories, it does not change either the valuation or the taxation of these different categories. There's no change made to current use in any way in this bill. And then you'll also see in this, after the structures bubble, it clarifies that those structures will be included in this open land and structures category only if they're not dwellings for human habitation. So if, for example, there was a short-term rental or perhaps farm employee housing, that would not fall into this category. Those structures would not be considered part of the open land and structures category. Those would fall into either rental housing or seasonal dwelling or one of the other dwelling categories. I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions before I move on. The next part of this graphic visual has some examples of types of properties that would fall into the categories.
Abby, just for my own sort of mental sorting, the purple categories there, are those all existing categories?
No, that's a great question. So those are what is new in this language. Those are all definitions that are being added in as categories of the non-homestead property.
Can you just tell me what we do have 6 existing categories though, right? Is that right? No, we don't.
No, so those are only on the grand list. I think there are actually more categories than that. It might be 10, but they are not in statute. And again, they're not uniformly applied across the state. There is also a sort of catch-all other category where other types of properties get sort of dropped in there. So this would be creating a new statutory requirement to categorize properties.
Okay, and would the idea at this point is that that would be something that the listers do?
So under, yes, unless there was some other change to statute, the current language only changes the categories. It doesn't change who is assessing or valuing or setting these properties on the grand list. So it would be up to listers in the town.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
But we might have the opportunity to say that people with the same, people self-certify for homestead or non-homestead.
Sure.
Maybe people are self-certifying for their non-homestead. But this is really an expansion of the non-homestead category that we use under existing tax law. Back to you.
That's right. Thank you, Madam Chair. On the second page, just for illustrative purposes, I've listed in each of the categories, again, they're just alphabetical here, as in the draft language, examples of what types of properties would fall into these categories. So the affordable housing definition does cite existing definitions of affordable housing, which relates to, I had that actually in the bubble up in the first page, rent when it's 30% of, when it's equal to or less than, I think I have the wrong, sorry, equal to or less than 30% of income. Also rent restricted units. So whether that's under state or federal law, Section 8 or housing vouchers, and rural development rental housing, any rental unit that or any property that has one of those types of programs linked to it will be categorized as affordable housing. In terms of the commercial category, that, as I mentioned, is drafted more like a catch-all. So it's any non-homestead property that's used for a business purpose that doesn't fit into one of the other categories. So that would likely be retail stores, restaurants, those sort of businesses. Industrial is what is sort of commonly understood to be industrial. It's defined in the language as property used to manufacture, process, fabricate, or finish items for wholesale or retail distribution. This language was modeled on actually some sales tax law that was enacted recently relating to manufacturing and manufacturing equipment. So it does say it's what is commonly regarded by the general public as an industrial manufacturing or processing operation or an agricultural commodity processing operation. Open land and structures is probably the longest definition within this language. It's any area of land. So it could be forest, could be farmland, and it could also be unproductive land. And as I mentioned before, that those types of land, as long as they're within a non-homestead property, regardless of whether they are enrolled in current use, they would fall into this category. And then structures like fences, barns, silos, as long as it's not used for human habitation, those structures would also fall into this category. And there is some language around the use of the land, and that is modeled on open space land definitions. So it does have some limits there as to what type of land falls into this category. So it's use of land which maintains and enhances the conservation of natural or scenic resources, protects natural streams or water supply, promotes conservation of soils, wetlands, beaches, or marshes, enhances the value to the public of abutting or neighboring parks, forests, wildlife preserves, nature reservations or sanctuaries or other open spaces, enhances public recreation opportunities, or preserves historic sites. And there is also a definition here further because of the reference to unproductive land. That means land, including wetlands, that is incapable of producing farm or forest products because of its soil or other site characteristics, or that because of its location, it's inaccessible or impractical to farm or log, for example, to harvest forest products. The next definition is rental housing. So that would apply to any type of rental housing where individuals are living there as their domicile, so as their primary dwelling. It is a fairly short definition, but it refers back to the landlord certificate. So it's any dwelling unit for which a landlord is required to submit a landlord certificate. If you'll remember a few years ago when the renter credit program was changed fairly significantly, taking effect in 2021, all landlords were required to submit a landlord certificate to the Department of Taxes. So having that requirement expands what's considered rental housing. So that would be any rental housing that isn't used for or doesn't qualify as affordable housing. So the intent here is for these categories to be mutually exclusive. The next two are where a lot of the discussion about creating categories has kind of pushed this discussion to the forefront. So it's these types of dwellings, seasonal dwellings. That category is for dwellings that are not weatherized for year-round occupancy. And that could be, so again, this would be interpreted and determined by listers and assessors. The not weatherized could mean a couple of different things. It could mean, not insulated for year-round occupancy. There could also be, if you decided, there could also be qualification in terms of septic or other local requirements to make it clear that it's whether it is or is not for occupancy as a primary dwelling. And again, because it is not rented or occupied by an individual as their official domicile, then it gets at the fact that this is not someone's primary dwelling if they are a renter. Or an owner, because if it was someone's primary dwelling as an owner, it would be a homestead. Secondary non-seasonal dwelling means that it is weatherized, it can be occupied year-round, but again, it is not a domicile and it is not rental housing because no landlord certificate is required. There is no one living there all year round. So to give a few examples, a seasonal dwelling would be a camp, a 3-season camp or cabin or cottage, and some short-term rentals would likely fall into that. If you do look at the language, you'll see there is no explicit reference to short-term rentals because they could fall into different categories depending on their structure, the way that they're built, if they're seasonal or not, and of course, depending on their use. Secondary non-seasonal dwellings would capture vacation homes as long as they can be used year-round. And that's probably where most short-term rentals would be categorized. And then the final category is utilities. So that is any utility regulated by the Public Utility Commission or the Department of Public Service. So that is the extent of the sort of visuals that I prepared. There are two other sections in the bill relating to the way this is broken out on the tax bill. And then the effective date. But before I move on to that, I just wanted to see if there are any other questions about the structure of it and the sort of the logic behind creating these categories.
Representative Messlin.
Compliments to the artist.
Here, here.
As I've said occasionally, I process better with visuals, graphics and various other kinds of things than words and words. Yeah. It's quite sophisticated, Abby. I'm impressed. It would require a little bit of work on the behalf of listers or assessors or wherever we go, That said, I think once we collectively figure out how to do it, it can be done.
Representative
Abby, the only thing I'm uneasy about is the second from the bottom. You use non as opposed to year-round, non-seasonal, and I wonder, though the fleshed out definition is year-round, is there a reason you think it would be better to say non than year-round?
I think that was just in contrary to seasonal dwelling. was to
Okay.
distinguish between the two.
Just, I always think of definitions starting with non as being less attractive than a positive definition, but maybe I'm just being fussy. And I have one other substantive one, rather than just taste. And that is where you have rental housing, I think you pointed out, it would include or potentially include, and this is wiggle room that I'm not sure we want, rental housing, whether it's on a long-term contract, that is to say, more than 30 days at a clip, as opposed to a motel, nightly kind of thing. And depending on how fine a point we put on that, commercial, because it includes property not otherwise categorized, I'm not sure that that's welcome wiggle room between rental housing and commercial not otherwise categorized.
I'm not sure I understand your,
Why would you want to conflate motels and apartment houses?
I guess I don't see them conflated
In rental housing?
because of the landlord certificate.
Yeah, so my
Rental
interpretation would
property.
be that a hotel or motel would fall into commercial,
Okay,
just the way this is drafted. I am, just as you mentioned that though, I just realized that the rental housing definition should explicitly call out that this does not apply to
Okay.
affordable
that
housing.
would cure
So I-
it, yeah.
That's
Thank you.
my, I didn't catch that, so I will just make it clear that rental housing is if it does not fall into the affordable housing category.
Representative Odie?
Thank you. I had a question from a constituent, so I'll just say what the question was. They are aware of people who have bought into affordable housing, then their incomes have gone up, and then they hold on to that affordable housing. And then I might be answering my own question, and then they have a place out of the state where they might live either more or less than 6 months a year, and they are still in the affordable housing unit. I don't think this is gonna be a problem that impacts this, but I just thought,
I imagine if we went forward with this, we would have folks from VHCB and VHFA to talk us through the definitions of affordable housing, and that might be a good time to bring up
bring
that
that up.
scenario.
Yes, it's a problem.
Yeah, Representative Beck.
Yeah, just one thing to think about, and maybe you already have, is
Enough to try.
by having a lot of different non-homestead categories, how complicated does that become if somebody, says, part of my building is commercial and part of it is, and we kind of do that now, but we only have two categories, homestead and non-homestead. And yeah, just a thought.
Yes, that's a good point. So already if, for example, someone has a home business and they use part of their home as the business, there are sort of square footage requirements if it's a business that is not a rental. So it's only if more than 25% of the square footage of a home is used for a business, then it will be sort of kicked out or carved out of homestead and will be classified as non-homestead and taxed at that rate. So there's already that parsing, but you're correct that with what this bill would do is within that non-homestead classification, there would then be further categories. And that it leads into section 2, which requires the property tax bill to identify the different categories. So you have homestead, non-homestead, and if you're in non-homestead, you'd also have this as your category for perhaps just a portion of your property.
And I wonder if, as we work through this, one option might be if the parsing if we imagine a scenario where the parsing would get too wild, that we could decide some categories have supremacy over one or the other. But I'm not, that would definitely be a serious policy judgment call, yeah.
Is the motivation behind setting up the categories to be able to collect better information, data, or is the idea that there would be separate tax rates for different categories?
I think the initial motivation and various conversations that we've had over the years was to have better data. And then from there to be able to possibly be more sensitive to changes. So I think one conversation we've even had in this room since we started is how the CLA creates this funny average between commercial properties that have gone down and house prices that have gone up. And wouldn't we be better able to sort of sensitize ourselves to changes in the market if we could actually identify those as two separate categories? Just as like one example for when it's come up before.
Okay, I'm a little concerned that if we have categories with different tax rates, that it's going to make calculating of the dollar yield more complicated as we try to maintain that growth within each category. That's.
Abby, did you have?
May I just, so the yields only apply to the homestead property tax. This is only within the non-homestead, and currently the non-homestead is a flat rate across the state, and then the CLA adjusts that for each town based on their equalization study.
Right.
So in terms of, you are correct that it may have an impact on the yield in terms of looking at revenue coming into the education fund, but it wouldn't directly impact the yield because this is a different tax rate and a different structure.
But don't the two tax rates have to go up parallel?
They actually don't.
They
Or at
do.
least some?
They just tend to. Like we do that, but they don't have to.
They do unless we decide to do
Yes.
something different.
Yes.
They're
Yes.
set independently, right?
If not,
Oh, look, Julia popped right up. Hello, Julia. Would you like to pipe in on this one?
Sure. For the record, Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. I just wanted to confirm the committee's conversation that we have, the income yield, the homestead yield, and then the uniform non-homestead property tax rate. We, by statute for the December 1st letter, need to solve those three so that the average tax bill either raises or lowers by the same percentage across those three classes. But then beyond that, it's up to the discretion of the General Assembly what the relationship change between those three classes are. For clarity's sake, I solve the yield model so that the average bill change across three classes is the same when calculating the yields and the uniform rate, unless I've been told otherwise by the legislators or by your committee.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd like to make a stab at answering why do this. Apropos of yesterday's presentation about taxes and the effect they have on patterns of development on land. While most of the attention seems to be on the ed side, I can imagine a community deciding on the municipal side as a development tool what the relative tax rates would want to be between commercial, et cetera, manufacturing as a development tool. And that's why I'm interested in it, quite frankly. I know most of the attention's on the ed side, but towns live and breathe on the municipal side. So this is a much finer surgical approach to land use and development without relying solely on zoning.
Abby, do you have more you'd like to take us through before we wrap up and then pick this up another day?
I did just want to point out the effective date. So that just to make it clear that this would apply at the start of this upcoming property tax year. So starting on July 1st of this year, but you would only see the change when the grand list is lodged next April. So that's why there are two dates there. So it would take effect as immediately as as possible within the grand list timelines.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes,
you.
Representative Maslin.
Answer to Kurt's question, why do something like this? This is far more sophisticated than I envisioned several months ago, but here we are. So it's been pointed out by school board members, which are concerned about taxes, that there are people who live in Norwich in very lovely houses for 5 months and 25 days or something like that, and are paying a far lower tax rate for a non-residential property than they would be if they actually acknowledged that they lived in Norwich and paid the residential rate. And I know that would vary from community to community. Some towns it'll be a birth, I guess, or something. So this proposal doesn't solve the problem that was brought to my attention a couple of months ago. As a matter of fact, it says, what the heck? But here we are. I think this is an excellent exercise to work through and see where we end up. There's great justification, I think, in a what's the word?
More discerning tool.
There you go. I'll go with that. More discerning tool. That's better language than I would have used. But thank you.
Did you? No.
I imagine this was already discussed, and apologies for missing the beginning of this, but if my non-homestead property qualified for a few of these, is the initial thinking that like I would file some percent as rental housing and some percent as industrial if somehow I had, and then I would pay a different rate for that portion.
The way Abby explained it was that we already have some folks who are paying one homestead rate and one non-homestead rate because they have a business on their property that they live on. So property tax bills are often already divided that way, and so they could be further divided. But in sort of further discussion, we came to the fact, like, if that gets too complicated, we can decide that we can start talking through the idea that some categories might have primacy over other categories. So if you're in one category, you're just automatically not in other categories, which is sort of already how the affordable housing category is set up in a lot of ways. Okay. Let's just think about this over the weekend. The bill's up there for you to read through. I have some witnesses in mind to talk it through more, but please let me know if you have others. And we will totally shift gears now to the Colchester Fire District.
Yes.
Such amazing.
Yes. Representative Waters Evans, would you like to join us? Thank you. So last year, this committee helped dissolve one of the fire districts. It seems Colchester has really an exorbitant number of fire districts, and
We have lots of.
so we might hear from more of them. And so I appreciate you joining us to tell us about.
Sure, I'm just gonna pick up number 3. They're not in order. Number 2 still exists. Spoiler alert. So I'm Shay Waters Evans. I'm the representative from Shoreline, from Government Operations and Military Affairs. Just a quick context. So there were, and Representative Taylor, please feel free to correct or inform at any point in time. So there are fire districts, they provided fire and water service in Colchester. And in 2019, the Colchester Select Board voted to merge the fire districts under one umbrella of the Colchester Fire Department. And then July 1st, 2020, is part of making that happen. Colchester Fire District number 3, which is what we're talking about right now, and its dissolution. In July of 2020, they paid off all their debts relating to the fire protection aspect of it, and they stopped providing that service. Colchester Fire Department took over. The water, the Colchester Fire District number 3 kept providing water service until June of 2022. correct. And then at that point in time, it's Champlain Water District, which already had control over some of the water service in Colchester, took over the water responsibility. So June 21st, 2022, they executed an asset purchase agreement that involved transferring the property, assets, liabilities. That includes a building and equipment as well as cash deposits. There were 3 bond bank loans that the Colchester town absorbed, I believe, is that correct? Responsibility for? Or with
Champlain Water.
the Champlain Water District, a responsibility for. Essentially, this has already happened. And I believe there are no financial transactions, nothing else needs to occur. It's already happened. So this is just a formalizing of a situation that already exists.
And my understanding is that the last dissolved fire district that came to us last year was the one that had the financial transactions in it. And that's why
Correct.
it came to us last time. And now all the rest of the dissolving fire district will come to us, even though there is no fiscal impact anymore. Does that sound right to you too?
That's my understanding.
Correct, but does that match your experience of reality?
That's my understanding of the situation, is that one was an anomaly and that is therefore now giving you the fun of weighing in on the other fire districts.
Does anyone on the committee have any questions? Tucker, would you like to join us for any particular reason?
I'm here.
Okay, does anyone feel any need to hear from Tucker on this one?
Would you like a motion?
I appreciate the good work of the Government Operations Committee, and I'd love a motion on this. Thank you, Tucker, for walking up the stairs.
Thank
Move
you.
if we find the proposal favorable.
Second, if you need one.
Do you need any support?
I just need a second of patience while I get my act together.
Great.
We have an intricate.
Oh, absolutely, discussion. Yes.
So has this been approved by the voters or?
Yes, the select board made the decision, and then within each fire district, they held their own vote. And it was, the date of the vote was, I have it somewhere. The answer is yes, they did vote in support of it.
Majority of people in each district voted yes.
So the select board made the decision initially, and then as each fire district is dissolved, the voters in that district vote individually, just that district votes. So for fire district number 3, which is the one we're talking about today, they did hold a vote and it did pass.
That's right, we're only doing number 3.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
I'm assuming when number 2 comes around, they will have another vote for that too. I think each district votes separately.
Are we ready to rock?
Any further discussion? You can call the roll.
All right. Andrews, yes. Sorry. Anthony,
Yes.
Beck,
Yes.
Brannigan,
Yes.
Demro,
Yes.
Maslin.
Yep.
Matos. Odie,
Yes.
Sims,
Yes.
Taylor,
Yes.
Canfield,
Yes.
Kornheiser.
Yes.
1101.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Hope you join us for the next fire district.
That was fun. I don't get to come up here very often. I know. I'll see you next year.
And with that, I think we are done for the week, everyone. Appreciate your good work. We now have gotten 2 bills out of committee. And see you on Tuesday after 4. Thanks.
Kurt, gonna present this?
Yes, Kurt, can you please present this bill?
Oh,
Thank you.
on the floor?
Indeed, yes.